All right, good morning. My name is Chris Teal. I am the managing editor of Route 50, which is part of the GovExec media group covering state and local government. I'm really happy to be here today for this excellent panel. Usually the last panel before lunch is kind of pressurized, right? Because you want to live up to expectations, and the last thing that you want to do is be the panel that people talk about at lunch and go, God, that was a load of rubbish, wasn't it? Mercifully, we have 4 experts who are here to talk about BEAD, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program from the federal government, $42 billion coming down to the states to roll out broadband. And we're going to have a great time. So what I'm going to do, I'm feeling a little bit power hungry this morning. I'm going to work my way down the line. What I'd like my panelists to please do is tell us who you are, the work that you do, and then, because it's that time of year, maybe share with us your favorite Winter Olympic sport. And if you don't do the Winter Olympics, that's totally fine. You can say that, but I'm just curious because it's fun. So why don't we start with you?
That's good. So Paul Garnett, I run a consulting firm called Vernonberg Group. We focus 100% on closing the global digital divide. So we work with clients both in the US and in emerging markets to help bring high-speed, affordable internet connectivity to unserved and underserved communities. Actually, it's funny. I had a conversation yesterday with my wife, and the question I asked her was, which Winter Olympic sport do you think you'd be best at? Yeah. And that was an interesting conversation. But my answer is not the one that I would be best at. But in terms of the ones that I think are the most exciting is the downhill skiing. Absolutely. That's the most thrilling thing to watch for me.
Hi, Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, director of the Center for Technology Innovation, founder of the AI Equity Lab, which workshops AI with subject matter experts in areas of health, criminal justice, financial services, employment, and the author of a book, which is now a year old, Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. You're all lucky. I wasn't shamed being a person to bring it and show it because I forgot it. But it's available wherever books are sold and Audible, and it'll be paperback this year. So Winter Olympics. So I don't do cold, so it's kind of hard for me to figure out which one, because the last time I tried to ski, I almost broke my leg, and I was 12, and I just never did it again. But I do the ice skating competitions. I will stay up and watch, but the other ones, unlike your wife, I just don't do cold, so it's hard for me to figure out which one.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lindsay Moyer. I am with Comcast, been with the company for 16 years. In my role, I work on network expansion, also with our company's investments in strategic nonprofit partners that we work with, as well as our presence at national convenings. Thank you for bringing up the Winter Olympics so I didn't have to. Comcast NBC.
Right.
Everyone, hopefully you are enjoying the excellent Olympics coverage from your favorite broadcaster. Legendary February, so tune in, enjoy, watch tons and tons of hours of content, and enjoy how it is being delivered to you through NBC and with Comcast technology as the underpinnings for that. I think I would do curling. I have no idea how good I would be, but I'd give it a good go.
I don't have a commercial here. So Joey Wender, I'm the executive director of the Shelby Coalition, the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition. We're a nationwide organization that works to ensure that all schools, libraries, health clinics around the country have affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. And my answer also was curling, because it's the only sport I watch and I say, I could definitely do that. Definitely.
I want to say thank you, panelists, first of all, because they had no idea that was coming, that I was just going to chuck them a nice big curveball to start with. Since you're all curious, I really like the slope style skiing, where you are doing all kinds of flips and tricks on your skis and going backwards down a hill, looking over your shoulder.
That's crazy.
Madness, absolute madness. And I would be dead probably within the first 100 yards. First trick, yeah, exactly. All right, let's talk about what we're talking about today, which is BEAD. The digital divide still persists, but there's a lot of money at stake right now coming down from the federal government. It's been fiddled with. We've had policy tweaks, we've had changes, we've had plans, we've had revised plans, benefit of the bargain. It's been an interesting few years since it got put in the infrastructure bill. But I want to start with a very general question. We've had the internet for a long time. I remember getting dial-up, and it was very exciting. Even despite my boyish good looks, I do remember a time pre-internet. We still have a digital divide. Why? Paul?
It's a big question.
Right, I was going to say, right.
Yeah.
Start with a softball.
First of all, there are all kinds of digital divides. So you kind of put them into sort of two main categories. One is an infrastructure gaps. The other is what we call adoption gaps. In the case of both of those gaps, on the infrastructure gap, you've got basically 6 million or so U.S. households that still don't have access to infrastructure at home. They couldn't buy high-speed internet connectivity even though they wanted to. And you've got programs like BEAD and ARPA and other funding mechanisms that are designed to close that gap completely. The other gap, as I said, is the adoption gap. That impacts about 25 to 30 million U.S. households. So the adoption gap is much bigger than the infrastructure gap. And in many ways, and we'll talk more about this, the adoption gap is a much harder challenge to address than the infrastructure gap. We all know how to build networks, but we don't necessarily know how to get people to use digital services and sign up for connectivity. But I think fundamentally it boils down to sort of marketplace failures. And on the infrastructure side, there are places that are typically lower population density, higher on average to serve, and are not places where an ISP can make a profitable return on their investment. And so they haven't gone there. They haven't built infrastructure. And that's the reason why you need programs like BEAD and ARPA and the high-cost universal service programs. And then on the adoption side, similar set of issues. There's another sort of failure there in the market where customers have had services that are perhaps too expensive for them. They're not relevant to them. A whole range of issues that have gotten in the way in terms of them signing up for services. And that in turn, an impact on the operators themselves because they can't sign up as many people as they want to and generate revenues off of that.
And I'm going to ask the rest of my panelists. I wasn't accusing you of being responsible for the digital, but Nicole, why don't we come back to you next?
Yeah, so this is interesting, and it's such a pleasure to be up here with all the folks and to see many of the audience that I started in this work almost 30 plus years ago. I would say that we have a digital divide because we have shamefully just failed to solve it over the last 3 decades. And part of that reason is because I think we've not reconciled this conversation between supply and demand. And that has mirrored, and I talk a lot about this in my book, of really throwing out the concept of digital divide and really dealing with this concept of digital invisibility, that we've had on both sides of the aisle this political will to want to solve something that's related to technology access. But on one side, it has to do with the supply and infrastructure. On the other side, it's had a lot to do with demand. And we've never quite found the sweet spot where we can actually build accelerated broadband networks while at the same time making them affordable for people. And every time we get close, like we did almost a few years ago, we roll back in one of those areas and then we start all over again. And so for me, it's like a digital divide that is persistently annoying to talk about simply because it's something that we could actually solve. And we have no choice to solve it because everything right now is online versus inline. And with the advent of AI, we're going to find a wider AI divide if we actually don't solve this digital disconnect that we have. So I want to echo what Paul said. I mean, a lot of it has to do with where are we investing? How are we spending time thinking about the investments? You know, my kids, when they get a really big research paper, they probably spend hours thinking about how they're going to write the paper. Sometimes I feel that's the same way with rural. We spend hours, days, decades trying to figure out how we're going to solve a topographical challenge and line of sight, all the things we talked about when I started this space 30 years ago when President Clinton was in office. And we still have failed to come up with, I think, a reasonable technology agnostic solution that works for everybody. And the more that we do that, we essentially disservice the people, I think, on the demand side who are now finding themselves caught of having to be digital without the appropriate assets. And so would love to catch up on this more, but I do think that it's a combination of political will, investment choices, time spent in the same narrative of this binary narrative, and most importantly, the inability to look at the real eyes on the prize, which are the people. And until we start putting our eyes on the people and why they need to be connected for the companies and communities, I think we're still going to talk about this divide into perpetuity.
Lindsay?
So I agree with my fellow panelists. I think the digital divide is not a single problem with a single solution. I like how Paul pointed out the two divides, the access divide, which is having access to the actual broadband infrastructure, and then the adoption divide, which is taking the service, having the means to adopt it in your home, the devices to be able to use it, the skills to be able to protect yourself online and to know how to navigate and use it for the betterment of yourself, your community. So talking about the access divide, that's why this public infusion of resources into this is really going to be transformational when paired with the private sector investments as well. I do believe that we are going to, at the end of BEAD, get the closest that we have ever been to closing that access gap in our nation's history. As Paul mentioned, though, the adoption gap is very persistent, and it has persisted in communities that have had access to broadband for quite some time. And so the solutions to solving the adoption gap are very different. I've heard a lot of folks liken where we are at this moment in time to the electrification of rural America. If you look back to how long that took, once folks agreed that was important to do, it took time. Infrastructure is hard, and I know that we'll talk about that a little bit later in our discussion. And then adoption is hard, and that's just, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. Certainly industry has a role to play in that. Comcast has been at work in the adoption space for quite a few years. You may have heard about programs that we have like Internet Essentials, which addresses affordability, but the other barriers to adoption, including devices as well as skills. We've also launched a number of lift zones across our footprint, which provides free internet access to communities. And then we invest in partnerships at the local level, which is where folks go to get resources through our $1 billion commitment in Project Up. So I would agree with my co-panelists. There are the adoption gap as well as the access gap, each of which have unique ways that you can begin to address it collectively.
Yeah, Joe?
I'll play cleanup here. I look at it from a public policy perspective, in part because I worked on the Hill for over a decade, and then I just worked in the last administration. I think our public policy with respect to closing the digital divide has been aggressive but incomplete. Okay, so start with the 96 Act, which I think is very appropriate to discuss today, given that this week is the 30th anniversary of the Telecom Act of 96. And the 96 Telecom Act laid out what it meant by universal service. And it made incredible strides at getting us to where we are today. It created the E-rate program to ensure that all schools and libraries are connected to high-speed internet. It created the rural health care program, which ensures that rural residents can enjoy the same type of medicine that their urban counterparts get. There's the high cost program, which is a lot of this discussion today, which obviously is about making sure that people in rural areas have communication services. And then there's the Lifeline program. And Lifeline is about making affordable personal mobile phone use. Okay, so that's a lot of great steps. I'm going to have a hot take here and say that Congress is actually on the right track. In the last few years, they have identified the holes that exist in the digital divide. I mean, let's name 4 of them. One is BEAD, which is the name of this program, which is the name of the subject of this panel, which is about bringing that access to all Americans. But it's also about the non-deployment money, which we'll get to in a second, right? That connects with the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP. Again, Congress is recognizing that there is an affordability program. Now, we could discuss whether having a one-time infusion or having some year-over-year fund is the right approach, but again, Congress recognized that there is this gap. Third, they passed the Digital Equity Act, again, recognizing that there are gaps in digital literacy and digital skills out there. And finally, something that it has not enacted but is looking at right now is there is a working group on the Universal Service Fund to say what does this fund or what should this fund look like for years or decades to come. So, I mean, ultimately, our public policy is incomplete, but we do have a lot of the ingredients here that would close the digital divide. I think a lot of it is a question of how does this administration enact or carry out or implement these acts.
Good stuff. All right, so let's talk about BEAD and bring it round to the focus of the panel. And Joe, I want to start with you as well. We'll come back this so you can lead off. What is, in your opinion, the biggest obstacle or obstacles that might prevent BEAD from being successful when we reflect on it in 15, 20 years?
Sure. I'm going to go to the adoption side, right? And that's where Paul started us. There's a $20 billion question out there. $20 billion. What is going to happen to the non-deployment dollars? What is going to happen to the dollars once we ensure that all dots on the map have access, right? And that question is very much alive right now. We don't know. BEAD has not issued guidance on it. Our opinion at Shelby is that states should be allowed to access that money consistent with what Congress said. And Congress laid out a whole plethora of options that could be used that states could identify in order to close the digital divide, particularly on the adoption, the affordability, the digital literacy side. So I think it's a major open question right now whether that money will be spent in accordance with congressional intent.
Yeah, Lindsay.
So looking around the room, I'm going to assume that there are some policy wonks that have been following BEAD since 2021. And for those of us, I would put myself in that category, who have read initial proposal after initial proposal, final proposal after final proposal, 5-year action plans, answered surveys. It may feel like we've got a lot of work under our belt, and that would be true. But what I like to remind folks is we are right about where BEAD gets hard. And that is where we move from policy setting to actual execution. And what is in execution? The construction of these networks that have been discussed and debated and talked about for years and years. I think Administrator Roth said it pretty well when she was speaking at an event and said that defaults are the Achilles heel of a lot of these types of programs. And so when you look at programs like RDOF and ARPA and CPF, I think this is a big year. 2026 has a lot of deadlines piling up. And so what does that mean for BEAD? How do you appropriately scope and scale what that could look like? I appreciate you mentioning non-deployment funds. If you tease that out and you look at what happened in terms of defaults in some of these other programs, you could look at the rate of default and then do a little bit of back of the envelope math and identify that perhaps maybe some of these leftover funds as a result of the benefit of the bargain round could be held in a reserve, so that with defaults or addresses that were not considered in the BEAD map, that they would get the opportunity to get service through the BEAD program. And so I think we'll talk about specific things like polls and permitting, as well as private rights of way, things like easements, that at this point in time, when we're just on the cusp of execution, we don't know the full extent to which that will play out in BEAD. But looking at the scale of BEAD and the fact that it is designed to be the program that closes the access divide once and for all, I think there are some key learnings about those items that can help us get a sense of how big a problem they could present in BEAD.
So I would just say on BEAD, I was excited and continue to be excited about the level of investment, considering that I followed a lot of government investment dating back to the Technology Opportunity Program and then the Broadband Opportunity Program. So I go way back years ago when we first started seeing an infusion of government capital. What I think has to be answered, though, as we see states and localities begin to build out their networks, are these questions of, if we build it, will they come? And I do not think that we've sufficiently addressed the non-deployment funds in a way that actually drives consumer adoption, especially at a time where we have given people the Affordable Connectivity Program and then we took it away. The confidence and trust in the networks that are being built will stand the test of time as to whether or not people are going to see them as an efficient supplement to their ability to be connected to something that's going to improve quality of life. So I think that's something that we need to think about. Where do the non-deployment funds go? And how do we use it to, again, balance this tension that exists between supply and demand? I also think it's important that we think about the resilience of these networks. I see a few of you in this room. We have seen networks to be developed, and we know that there are questions about resiliency, maintenance of those networks, the extent to which those networks are modernized. This is a question I think that we need to continue to answer. When we invest these assets, how will these be regularly maintained? The Assistant Secretary has made it known that this might be the last government subsidy that goes to states. She's been pretty clear that the government doesn't want to invest more money in this. This kind of goes to what Joey talked about. Congress has done a good job of putting the right public policies out there, but I'll add a caveat. They haven't finished the job. And so part of it is like, how do you make sure that you have networks that can be maintained? What support will be needed so that it's still a balanced funding mechanism of private industry and government and not just one, because we've seen how that's worked out in the past. And then two, how do you ensure that the conversations around the growth of these networks accommodates these other demands that have also thrown themselves in, like satellite and other things that all of a sudden are being redirected to resources that were sort of developed around fiber. So I'm more curious about that. I'm just sort of sitting down with my popcorn trying to figure out what's going to happen next. But if history is any level of detail, there's a potential that we'll see that these networks may be subjected to corrosion over the years because of the lack of government investment alongside industry.
Yeah, I guess the analogy I think of is like hills and mountains. And I think on the infrastructure side, there's a lot of challenges we're gonna run into. There'll be issues around defaults. That's inevitable. There'll be companies who made promises that don't fulfill them, and someone else is going to have to step in and take on the responsibility. There'll probably be another round of BEAD infrastructure funding, I would guess, because there's going to be locations that were missed the first time around. There's new construction that happens in rural America all the time, and they'll have to take care of those locations as well. There are things like permitting, definitely challenges around that, but eventually they can be addressed. To me, the mountain is the adoption issue. That's our Everest, right? I mean, it's like, how do we solve that problem? I do a lot of work with internet service providers, both in the US and in emerging markets. We guide investments in those companies. I actually invest in some myself. The internet service providers know how to build networks. They know how to bring high quality service, 5 nines kind of network builds, and they can do all that. The thing that is always the challenge for them is getting customers and and generating enough revenue off the network from those customers in order for them to be sustainable. That's really hard. And I just worry that we're going to end up with all these networks built and services rolled out, and you're still going to have this segment of the population that does not sign up for service, even if it's available. And again, there's a host of issues around that. Affordability is one of them, but even as we saw with the ACP, even when you make it free, some people don't sign up. So there's trust issues and all kinds of other things that are relevant there.
Yeah, absolutely. Several of you have brought it up, and I think we should keep pulling on this thread of the non-deployment funds. It could be as much as 21 billion, I think, is one estimate we've heard out of an original 42 that it turns out we just kind of have this big pot of money. But I guess I want to make this a little bit more freeform, so whoever wants to start can feel free. But I mean, what do we do with it? How do we make it happen? How do we make it a reality? And how does it end up not being dogged by accusations of it being a slush fund or anything else that it could get mixed up in? Who wants to take the first swing at that? No pressure.
I would start just by saying that this was anticipated. That we always knew there was going to be money left over. We worked on Vermont's BEAD plan, and I remember having back and forth with the staff, and they're like, oh, we're just going to spend it all on fiber builds and we'll be done. And it's like, no, if you've been successful in bringing connectivity to all the locations in the state, you're going to have money left over. It could be $10 or it could be $10 million. It's going to be something. So what is your plan for that money? And then if you look at the Infrastructure Act itself, there's a whole list of things that are in the act that Congress anticipated could be candidates for programming and funding that were not just about last mile network deployments. I don't really like this whole non-deployment deployment language, because even on the list of undeployment activities, you have things like bringing connectivity to community anchor institutions and Wi-Fi for multi-dwelling units and other activities that actually are very related to deployment, just not necessarily deployment of last mile infrastructure. So I think all of this was anticipated. And the good problem that we have is there's so much leftover funding. And part of the reason for that is because NTIA took a technology neutral approach to the last mile connectivity piece. For a while there, it looked like it was just going to be fiber. And of course, if it were just fiber, that would have cost $120 billion, which is 3 times the size of the BEAD appropriation. So thank God for other technologies coming into play and picking up the hardest to reach places and making commitments to connect those. So yeah, we're going to get some guidance from NTIA hopefully on this. And there is a whole bunch of money there, and Congress anticipated that some amount would be left over and for those kinds of purposes and potentially others that NTI identifies.
So, Joey, I know you wanted to.
Yeah, I think there's a framing problem here on two fronts. I think the first, and Paul started on this road, though I'm going to correct his language. Like, we've got to stop saying leftover money. It is not leftover money. It's additional money, or it's money that was appropriated by Congress to states to close the digital divide. That's what it is. Okay, so that's the first point. I think the second point is, and it's a lesson I learned, ARPA and capital projects have been referenced a couple times. I mean, that's what I did under the last administration. I was the director of the Capital Projects Fund at the Department of Treasury. And something I said over and over again was, Washington does not know best. These programs are designed to defer to states. This is not RDOF, right? These are not supposed to be federally centered programs. Both the Treasury money and the BEAD money, the idea is to defer to states explicitly. It lays out the steps in which states come up with their plan. How are you going to use the deployment money? What we call non-deployment money. How are you going to use it? And so long as it's within the rules that NTIA sets out, states should be allowed to go forth. States know best what their connectivity needs are, and it's different between New York and Nebraska and North Dakota, and that's part of the point. That's the whole intent behind these programs. And so what I'd really want to see is an emphasis on state decision-making, local decision-making, state discretion. Paul referenced community anchor institutions. States themselves, we think, are best positioned to decide what is and is not an anchor. Obviously, schools, libraries, health clinics are, but there's a whole long list in the Act. And then there's a catch-all phrase in the Act about community support organizations. I think those decisions should be made in state capitals on the local level and not here in D.C.
Yeah, I would echo what Joey says. I think that there should be some discretion to the states to determine how they want to actually distribute that money that is going to be left over. One, it can fill the gap of what was lost from the Digital Equity Act itself when it was appended. But most importantly, I think there's another caveat that could be added. Digital literacy is one side of this. I think that there's also this opportunity for states, by revisiting the community anchor institution discussion, to do more institutional capacity building. We're assuming, because technology has moved so fast, that people just want basic literacy, but they're going into institutions that are also do not have basic literacy or technology assets. So what does a new library look like? What does a new school look like? How does a state start to think about the role of correctional institutions as anchor institutions within their community when they're trying to bring access to rural communities? Could there be an opportunity to do some type of model which brings access to people who are visiting loved ones at the bus station? I think states should really begin to think about, how are we building not just the individual, the community, but the institution? Because at the end of the day, that's going to be the byproduct of whether or not we've had a successful job, that a senior can walk into a doctor's office and be able to get the same type of service that someone else is getting who lives in a quite wired community. I do this idea also of a consideration of reserve based on what I said earlier, in terms of resilient networks. Where are we going to find money to fill the gaps if things fall off? And then I also think, to Paul's point, this could be an opportunity to rebid out to smaller communities who just missed the mark. Are there localities where we need to actually rethink where we didn't put enough money in, or we might have missed them because they weren't prepared to actually compete in this space, where they also might be experimenting? I remember when we did the BTOP experiments and pilots. I don't know if some of you remember, but that was 10 years ago or so, that we started thinking about ways to sort of reimagine Lifeline through these BTOP projects. So the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program was having this, it was either BTOP or was at that FCC, they wanted to do these pilot projects. What we ran into, if some of y'all remember, is we didn't have any money. So a lot of people reimagined pilots to actually rethink how to bring broadband into communities along the same verticals that we're talking about. They did it 10 years ago, but there was no money to do so. So I do think giving states the ability to sort of think about, where are we missing, what do we need to do better experimentation, would be very helpful to move the needle. I just worry that this money, and I guess I'll say it, will be caught up in other things that have nothing to do with closing the digital divide. I worry that it'll go into AI infrastructure and data centers because it's a slush fund of opportunity. I worry that it may go into money that's addressing children's safety in terms of campaigns versus thinking about what we're trying to solve here. I think we need to really think about how this money goes to the bread and butter of what we're trying to solve, so then we can do the appropriate campaigns and training and have the distribution for information, good information to get out to families and communities.
I'll just touch on a couple things because my fellow panelists hit on them. One, you heard reserve fund mentioned, I think, quite a few times. These dollars, and I appreciate the BEAD dollars to solve the gaps, close the gaps that BEAD was intended to close, should be used for those purposes. They should be used to ensure that we get connectivity, that Americans that do not currently have access to broadband, at the end of when these dollars are spent, have access to broadband. And so reserve fund was talked about quite a few times, whether that is solving for default, solving for new addresses that are added to the map or addresses that were missed in the map. That could go a very long way to making sure that BEAD accomplishes its goal and that we accomplish the mission through appropriate use of these funds. The other thing, and I think we'll talk a little bit about barriers to deployment in a minute, is taking these funds and making sure that they are being helpful to overcoming barriers to deployment, which anybody that's ever worked on broadband in rural America from a public policy perspective or from a construction perspective are aware of. You've got poles. What does the pole infrastructure look like in rural America? You've got permits. In rural America, what does permitting capacity look like? Who is on deck? Who is prepared? Who has what they need to make sure that when they are getting all of these permits to get broadband out, that they're able to process them and not delay the project in an expedited manner. And then you've got the private rights of way, things like easements. I don't know if anyone in the room has heard about easements or had the privilege of working on easements. This can really delay or jeopardize an entire project from getting done. It's complicated, it takes time, it takes resources. And so I do think that these BEAD funds, ensuring that the mission of BEAD gets accomplished, that Americans in the rural and hardest to reach areas of our country get the promise of broadband delivered, it should be priority number one.
Absolutely. Lindsay, I want to stay with you. Since you brought up the idea of permitting and infrastructure and all this sort of thing, I'd love to just hear more, maybe perhaps starting with you, and we'll come to some other folks, about how do we make that side of the house a little bit maybe easier to get some of these projects done? Is it just a case of changing the law and putting in some shot clocks and speeding up the permitting process and off it goes? I assume it's a lot more nuanced than that, but I would love to just start a discussion about that.
It is a lot more nuanced than that, but I do think that action at the federal, state, and local level, it's kind of an all of the above approach that it's going to take. And each issue is unique and has its own nuance. You've got certain amounts of authority over here, certain amounts of authority over there. I think the number one thing is just being in conversation with one another, whether it be providers communicating with the state broadband offices communicating with the utility owners, the co-ops, the local communities, making sure that everyone is in a solution-oriented mindset and coming to the conversation with the end goal in mind that we want to get this done. I think we had a pretty good and interesting result last week. The FCC's rapid response docket came to a decision on an issue between Comcast and a utility provider in the state. And I mean, there's make-ready costs, things like that when you actually engage in the construction of a network, make-ready costs that were not foreseen when you were let's go back to the benefit of the bargain round. You have a couple of weeks to pull together your application, to submit it, and then you go through curing, and then it gets approved. When you get out and you actually start constructing and you get the receipts of these make-ready costs, if you're being charged for a third-party provider's issues with the polls, I mean, that can blow the financials of an entire project, or it can delay it to the point where you have to go through a long bureaucratic process at the state PUC and then the federal level. So I do think that it'll take an all of the above approach. We have to be in conversation with one another. We have to know where the barriers are, and then we have to really agree to just what does everybody bring to the table? What are all the stakes? And let's find a path towards resolution. These communities have been waiting for long enough. It's time to get to work.
Who else wants to take on permitting? A nice small topic for us all
I
to...
guess the only thing I would just add that on the good news side, there's been a lot of good action at the federal level. In the last week, the case in Virginia is an example of that, where common sense prevailed on that one. But at the federal level, a lot has happened to accelerate environmental reviews, historical preservation on federal land reviews. So there's a lot that state and local governments can learn from what has happened at the federal level and use some of those models to accelerate what's happening locally. And NTIA certainly can play a role on that, as can other federal agencies, in helping their state and local stakeholders better understand how that all works.
I'll just add one little thing that I probably thought I would never say as part of the permitting conversation, but it's some recent work I've been doing at Brookings on data centers who are having the same conversations about permitting, expedited environmental reviews, et cetera. I think this is an interesting time because I do agree with you. We're making a lot of progress on the federal side of expediting and accelerating the process, something that we've been working on for many, 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 many years. And now I think we're at a point where it's in coinciding with the government build out. But I would add this, as I've been on the other side among state and local leaders who are now looking at the permitting process on the AI side. It appears to me that at some point there might be an interesting convergence of these conversations that are going to happen for the better, for the worse, right? Based on the crowdedness of the polls and the extent to which the utility companies are still sort of between the two spaces. Could be a great opportunity, and I'll just add this out because this is what I do at Brookings, to sort of think through how these spaces converge before they hit a roadblock versus to sit back and watch them both in parallel operate. I mean, data centers and AI need telecom assets, point blank, full stop. And I think that's a conversation that we're not having enough of, the extent to which even if we build out AI, we still need basic access to internet-enabled devices for people to take advantage of it. And in my history of watching this debate, it is something I think for those of us who follow this in this space to keep an eye on, right, as to where these areas will find themselves converging, where they might become more disparate, and how that's going to impact, I think, the full ecosystem that we're trying to build when it comes to the technology economy and what that looks like for these rules that we're creating today. So I thought I would just add that as some things that you should know, which I have found to just be extremely interesting on the data. We've published, just for a shout out, 2 papers, Darrell West and myself, on data centers. We just published a paper last week on community benefit agreements. But it's just an interesting conversation that's not being had as to the role of telecom facilities in this conversation.
You've all talked about digital skills and digital literacy and all this sort of thing. And I approached this subject thinking about last night and some of the commercials which had me waking up in a cold sweat.
Why they were that bad?
A couple that were a little bit much, if I'm being honest. But I mean, that's just me. And I consider myself fairly digitally literate and maybe know a thing or two about technology. But Nicole, I want to start with you since you wrote the book on it. How do we approach digital literacy, digital skills in this kind of era of BEAD? What are we doing right? What are we getting wrong? What can we do better?
So I'll just share a couple of examples from my book. When I went to a rural community and met a person who was a 4th-generation resident in Staunton, Virginia, he needed digital access because he was a day laborer and he was not able to find a job. And he knew how to use his technological device, but due to a variety of reasons, he could not maintain his service. And the reason he stands out is I interviewed him and his family. I left and came back 2 weeks later, and he was still unemployed. And for me, that is a digital skill that we're not reaching if someone doesn't know how to navigate through this digital ecosystem in a way that makes sense for their quality of life. Having been a person, and you talked about Internet Essentials, I just found a report from 2010 on Internet Essentials when that program was started in my archives. I pulled it out of the crate. I was going to give it to Brett Perkins as a souvenir. And when I think about digital skills, when I started in this space, digital skills was essentially connecting people to certifications, word processing, certifications like network security. In my work, I was taking people who lived in public housing and teaching them network certification, and they were moving out of public housing because they had an identifiable credential that allowed them to actually compete. I think things have changed, right? We're teaching people digital literacy skills, but it's no longer about email. We're teaching folks about how to connect to the internet for jobs, but it's no longer about jobs. It's about your ability to maintain some privacy when you go into that library and you put your resume online in a public kiosk and what happens to that data. It's about your ability to follow through on that application because they don't call you anymore. The next stop is an email saying that you've passed this part of the certification. I want to set up an interview. So I really go back to what Joey talked about in terms of universal service. For me, outside of it being personal, it's one of those things like we have to go back to digital skills the same way we looked at why we wanted universal broadband in the first place. We wanted people to have immediate, real-time access to information. And we want people to have real-time access to those skills that are going to improve the quality of their life. For me, in my research most recently, after doing this for 30 years, it's about how is digital access and literacy going to improve the quality of your life? How are you going to become much more economically prosperous? How are you going to have better life chances? How are you going to thrive versus surviving in a space where you no longer can hand over a business card? You actually have to have something on your phone that someone scans as a QR code, which I don't know how to do myself, and I can't imagine anybody else who doesn't have the level of competency that I have. And so I feel like we're still sort of talking about sometimes the same skills, or to Joey's point with Shelby, with many of his partners, we're not allowing those organizations to break free of the traditional paradigms for how we've looked at digital literacy. And so I think we need like a total disruption, as technology would say, of the space so that we're matching people into areas in which they're actually improving upon their ability to be much more competitive today.
It's hard to top that, particularly given that she wrote a book about it. But
yeah, it is hard, isn't it?
Very hard, very hard, very hard. But I would acknowledge this. When it comes to digital literacy and digital skills, I do think there's a real bias against it, particularly in communities like this. I'm just going to say the words. You all have at least one or two devices on you right now. But you walked in, there's probably 1.7 devices per person at this conference right now, right? This stuff we take so for granted. And I can tell you, I visit a lot of libraries and schools as part of my job, and I go to libraries and people want to talk to the digital navigator. Like they want these skills. And sometimes it's even the most basic skills. I was at a library earlier this year, or late last year, I should say, and it was over 50 women in a back room learning Excel, whether that be for personal finance, whether it be for starting a business, whether it be because they're just geeks and they're curious and interested in how Excel works, because it's an incredible product, right? That we just take it for granted. We just do. Everybody in this room just takes it for granted. And it's just not the case. There's so many people in this country that do not have those types of skills. And sorry for shaming you from being on your phones.
I have a couple things written down that struck me that my fellow panelists said. One is, Paul, adoption is our Everest. I think you shared long-term sustainability. These investments in these networks can result in tremendous economic development opportunity if they are used meaningfully by the communities and by the people that live in these communities. And so we talk about resiliency of these networks, long-term sustainabilities of these networks. Think about the multiplier effect. You take the investments of BEAD, coupled with the investments of the private sector companies that are building these networks out, and then you talk about the digital navigation, the digital literacy, all of that. There was a report a few years ago by the National Skills Coalition, just to crystallize it a little bit more, that 92% of jobs back 2 years ago, I'm sure the percentage has gone up, require at least one digital skill. This is not like for the state of the net related jobs that we're talking about. We're talking about day laborers, we're talking about folks that work in meatpacking companies, we're talking about just everyday life. And so you invest to deploy these networks, to go to these communities, to make them sustainable. You need folks to take the service. And for them to take the service, they have to understand what they can use it for. And so it strikes me as we can't miss this opportunity. It makes good business sense to have strong adoption. It's a good ROI on our collective investment as a country to have adoption of these networks. And what adoption can do from a financial and economic development perspective, who knows? But it could be, and we should expect it to be, tremendous.
Just a couple of things I would add to what has already been said on digital skills. I think sometimes it's a question of what are we even talking about when we talk about digital skills.
Right.
So digital skills, that's on a continuum, right? So it's anything from teaching grandpa how to actually get online for the first time all the way to educating the next generation of computer scientists and the workforce that will work at data centers and that kind of stuff. So there's this sort of continuum, and I think it's important and all of it matters, right? So anything from basic digital skills all the way to and how to use technology to creating technology, all of that matters. So I would just say that it's important for state broadband offices, territorial broadband offices, when we talk about BEAD, have the flexibility to, do workforce, that's great, but also don't forget about granddad. Rural America is 10 years older than urban America, so we have to take care of them as well. So it's the continuum. And the other thing, just to add, is we did a paper recently for International Telecommunication Union, and there is no globally harmonized way of measuring digital skills attainment. So it's like, how do we even know whether people even have digital skills? So I think that's another thing that we definitely could benefit from is some sort of like agreement on, okay, what does it mean to have basic digital skills all the way up to advanced digital skills, and then have a mechanism for measuring attainment of it so that we can know whether people actually have acquired the skills they need to participate in the economy.
Well, can I jump in on that? Because one word I didn't say, and I normally say it one time in a panel, is equity. I do think it's important that however we distribute this, that we're doing it in a way that also, to everybody's point, also targets like who are we talking to when we talk about digital skills, right? So I think it's really interesting in some of the work that I've been doing. You could talk to big populations of people. I've had the opportunity to talk to 500 people in a room. They actually know what you're talking about, and they just need some language to sort of frame what it is, right? So people who work locally know you could be in a room, you can start talking about all these things, you know this. They actually know what you're talking about. But the challenge is not necessarily knowing what you're talking about, is having the equitable access to that technology to be successful. And so I think part of the digital skills and literacy conversations have to really have a pinpoint of who are we trying to cover. If the BEAD program was committed to unserved and underserved communities, we should be doing the same thing when it comes to digital skills and digital literacy. What communities are not getting the resources that they need in their local libraries? How is a rural, when I did my book, it just hurt me that rural Americans, for example, in one instance, had to wait 2 hours for a doctor to come to their community because of the distance they were from a hospital, and then wait 2 weeks before that doctor returned and had no communication whatsoever to actually hear because they didn't have access to broadband. And so I think I think we could actually measure some of this stuff by looking at our impacts on health, our impacts on education, our impacts in these areas. Are we seeing better throughputs and outputs because we've created less difficult situations where people can be connected, and we're sensitive to, these are just folks that just have to have general literacy about why they have to use their phone to monitor their blood pressure when they're not with their doctor, or they need to be online to be able to talk to their teacher during a snow day. PG County right now is adding all these days because we lost learning days. And I'm thinking, if we just had people in virtual learning, we probably would have gained 5 of those days. But it's things like that I think we have to consider, where are those equity drops so that we can do a better job targeting that.
Look, we're at time, and I don't want to keep anybody from lunch and what have you. I'm told it's a networking lunch, whatever that means, but I'm sure our panelists will be more than happy to speak more if you have questions or comments or thoughts or anything else. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking them.